Okay, I think we'll get started. We'll get started. There are some people still coming in. My name is Joe Trotter. I'm the Giant Eagle Professor of History and Social Justice at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm also the director of our Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this 13th annual lecture of the Margaret Morrison Distinguished Lecture Series. But on behalf of CAUSE, we are collaborating with the Margaret Morrison Lecture, and I want to extend a welcome to you on behalf of the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy. Today, we are pleased that our department head, chairman, will give the introduction to our speaker. And so I want to call Donna Harsh, the chair of the Department of History, to the podium.
Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see such a big crowd here. I'm very, very pleased to see you at the 13th Annual Margaret Morrison Distinguished Lecture in Women's History. Our host, and our usual host, and the annual organizer of this this talk, is Lisa Tatro, and she cannot be here because she had to be in DC this evening, and she sends her regrets. So I'm Donna Harsh, as Professor Trotter pointed out. I'm head of the history department, and I'm proud to welcome our speaker, Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens. First, I want to make a few thank yous. I want to thank Lisa Tatro for organizing this. I want to thank Natalie Taylor of the history department. She's our business manager, Jesse Wilson, who is here taking photographs, and especially Amy Hallis Wells, not sure exactly where she is because she's always working. She is the reason that Professor Cooper Owens has even got here, and the reason you have so much nice food. I want to also thank the co-sponsors. The history department is a co-sponsor, CAUSE is a co-sponsor, as is the Dietrich College Grand Challenge Initiative, and the University Lecture Series. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Professor Cooper Owens is an associate professor of history at Queens College, CUNY, the City College of New York, City University of New York. She also directs the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia, one of the nation's oldest institutions. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won the Darlene Clark Hine Award from the Organization of American Historians. It has been widely praised and has positioned her as a rising star in the historical field. Working at the intersection of multiple fields, Dr. Cooper Owens exemplifies the best of historical scholarship, asking her readers and listeners to make connections between the past and the present and to be responsible toward these connections today. Before receiving her PhD from UCLA, Dr. Cooper Owens graduated proudly from the all-women's Bennett College, a historically black college and university, or HBCU. This seems an opportune moment to mention that Bennett College is currently in financial trouble, at risk of closing, and could use your help. Google it and move in. After a distinguished career at Queens College, CUNY, Dr. Cooper Owens will move inland this fall, joining the Department of History at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, as the inaugural Linda and Charles Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine and the Director of the Humanities in Medicine program. With this new position, she will become one of only 2 black women in the United States leading a health humanities program. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens for her lecture, Medical Bondage and the Birth of American Gynecology.
All right, this is on. I am so happy to be here and to see all of you. Thank you for coming. And I was sharing with some of my colleagues that I met, Pittsburgh is like a treasure trove of surprises for me. As I was coming here and waiting on the shuttle, I was trying to be cute, so I took my glasses off and I can't see. And so I just saw a group of 4 black women and I did, what we call the nod to say hello. And so then I put them on and I'm like, Yamu? And she was like, Deirdre. She literally lived next door to me in my dorm my freshman year at college and had a bunch of Bennett College students with her. She's a professor now. So as I'm making my way out, I catch eyes to do the nod again. And then I see this gentleman here who I have not seen literally since I was 18. We were in high school together. And he came out to support me. So thank you, Jermaine Fulton, for coming. I'm really, really pleased. And so I thank you all for coming, for sharing space with me, for giving your time. I'd also like to thank my wonderful, gracious host, Lisa, who is not here, unfortunately, but she is doing really wonderful things in DC for a women's history exhibit. Dr. Trotter and Dr. Harsh, I want to get it right. And then the graduate students who have just been excellent, who have a trio of them who've really been quite gracious and helpful to me. So I'm going to begin by, and I shared a little bit with this in an undergraduate class that I spoke to today. I like to really start with genealogy, a kind of intellectual genealogy. And let me just share with you right now, in case you're ready to say, oh, Lord, this is a 19th century talk. I do like Brother Malcolm. I'm getting ready to go to Nebraska. And people always say, what's in Nebraska? I'm like, Omaha, the home of Malcolm X. So I tend to make it plain, right? You won't hear a bunch of academic jargon. I tend to want us to be on the same page. So the intellectual genealogy journey I'm going to take you on for the first few minutes is really explaining how I got to this place, right? I never imagined myself being a historian of medicine. But one day, I literally was emceeing a program when I was still in grad school at UCLA, and Janetta Cole, who was the then president of Bennett College, was going to be in conversation with Reverend James Lawson, who is a civil rights icon. So I did my homework, read the new book that was written by Janetta Cole and Beverly Guy Sheftel called Gender Talk. And in the middle of the book, only 2 or 3 sentences, I read about this man. I'd never heard of him before, Dr. James Marion Sims. And I was startled to know there was someone considered the father of American gynecology who I'd never heard of. And then what was really interesting and kind of striking for me was the experimental work he had performed on enslaved women in Alabama. And I thought, because I didn't have a dissertation project, I thought this might be a really interesting dissertation project. And so as I started to kind of peel back the layers and I saw he did similar experimental work on poor Irish immigrant women in the North, I thought, okay, I have a comparative history. And so little did I know when I graduated in 2008 that there would be, this kind of groundswell of interest in this topic, right? A 19th century topic that really resonates for a 21st century audience. And so how in the world did I come from being someone who was, self-identified as a historian of slavery, a historian of medicine, to, by some accounts, the foremost historian of James Marion Sims in the country, right? That was not anything I planned at all. I was living in New York and had to confront the contested legacy around Sims. But not just Sims, but his statue, right? The symbolic representation of Sims. And so in about August 2017, before my book was out, I started to get texts and emails and a couple of DMs and in social media. And people were like, hey, you didn't tell me, are you organizing the protest? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And this is what they were talking about. There was a white supremacy protest going on in August of 2017, and it was sponsored by the Black Youth Project 100. Number one, I couldn't have been involved because the cutoff age is 30, and that ship has sailed many, many moons ago. So I didn't know what was going on. And then literally my life changed, even though I had nothing to do with it, because of this photo that went viral, right? Many of you have seen it. And these were members of the New York chapter of the Black Youth Project 100. The woman in the head wrap, her name is Jewel Cadet. She was then vice president of the BYP 100, and she staged an artistic protest for the removal of the Sims statue. And let me just give you some background. It's not the only statue of Sims in the United States. There are two more in South Carolina at the State House in Columbia, and another in Montgomery, Alabama, where he did the experimental surgeries. So the East Harlem Preservation Society had done a lot of organization and protest work on the ground for nearly a decade. I remember the first time I heard about them, I literally was graduating from UCLA in 2008. So the BYP, right, literally amplifies the work of the East Harlem Preservation Society because they're millennials and they know how to use social media. And so they put this image out that's really quite striking and jarring, right? It arrests you. And they put this out to have a call to remove James Marion Sims' statue from Central Park. Now, Central Park is really large, and the most eastern part of it borders East Harlem, which is a primarily Latina, Afro-Latina community, and it also sits across from the New York Academy of Medicine. So here you had community members who were asking for its removal. All of a sudden, right, I'm told within a few weeks by my editor, I'm at a university, academics can tell you this hardly ever happens. My editor calls me and says, we're going to release your book 2 months early. We have to ride this wave. So I said, okay. But for academics, I do kind of old school history. It's plantation, it's antebellum. I didn't think, it doesn't deal with statues. I didn't think anybody would be very interested. And all of a sudden, I start to get calls from the press. What do you think about the statue? Do you want it removed or do you want it to stay? And so I realized it was an opportunity for me to do what a lot of historians aren't given the opportunity to do, which was provide context. And also, I was a mass comm broadcast journalism major in undergrad, and so I didn't want to play nice. So I never answered the question because I wanted to talk about what's the legacy of medical racism? What are the implications for people who are the descendants of these enslaved women, right? The descendants of poor Irish immigrant women, right? What are the implications in the 21st century when we think about maternal morbidity and infant mortality? And so, as you can imagine, the journalists were not pleased with my answer, and that's okay. But what I was able to really garner was the attention of a lot of activists, especially in the reproductive justice movement and the birthing justice movement, who started to, reach out to me and we could do collaborative work. So, the book comes out. All of a sudden, I'm now known as the James Marion Sims historian. And April 17th, 2018 rolls around. All of a sudden, I'm getting calls again. I'm getting inbox messages. People rarely slide into my DMs. For those who are older like me, that's direct message, right? I've been married a long, long, long time. And so when I get a DM, it's like, hey, do you want to give a talk at this place? So I'm like, what's going on? I must be really loved because my birthday is April 17th. And so I was like, this damn Sims just continues to haunt me, right? His statue was removed on my birthday. And so there's still controversy around this. So it was being removed from Central Park, and in fact, the only statue in any of the 5 boroughs that was removed under order of Mayor Bill de Blasio by the New York City Parks Commission. So it was to be moved to the Green Lawn Cemetery in Brooklyn, where Sims is buried. The Brooklynites weren't having it. And so now the statue is kind of in limbo in storage, right? And I'm still getting emails. We'd like for you to collaborate on this. I'm just like, I'm all about the women and the babies, right? That's just not my calling. That's somebody else's calling, not mine. So all of a sudden, I now have to confront not just his contested legacy, but also a lot of misinformation on both sides, right? So you literally have people who, read Sims as a benevolent character who, out of the kindness of his heart, kind of gathered up all of the sickly cases of enslaved women suffering from a gynecological condition, took them under his care, spent his money on them and helped to repair them at whatever cost, right? This is one narrative. And then the other, right? Sims was a monster who intentionally butchered the reproductive parts of enslaved women. Now, this is the thing. I know some of the activists. So the woman, and I'll go back here, Jewel Cadet, I remember we met each other, and I said, we need to do lunch. So, I treat her out because she's younger than me. And she does activist work. And, oftentimes they don't get paid what they need to get paid. So we're talking, and I was like, so, sister girl, have you read the book? She says, no, I haven't. I said, so I'm going to gift it to you because there's some things that you're saying that aren't quite factual, right? And that makes me feel really uncomfortable because here I am looking the way that I look, right? The descendant of the people that he experimented on, and I'm offering facts that kind of diverge a little bit from what people have been saying. So, I'm really aware of that. And let me tell you why I was really careful to present the facts and also teach people about the way historians do our job. So a lot of the misinformation comes from the framing of the issue. The one thing I learned in graduate school at Clark Atlanta University was the either-or paradigm, that kind of binary framing of either-or, can be quite harmful and dangerous, right? And so this was also the high age of Afrocentricity. Millennials now call it hotepery. But this is, we laugh, but Clark Atlanta's newsletter was called Hotep, I promise you, in the 1990s. So this was the age where we were like, not about either-or, but both and, right? Because it's more nuanced. And so when you have newspaper articles, and I was interviewed in this one, which was actually written quite well, Savior of Women or Medical Monster, right? The fraught legacy of South Carolina's most infamous physician by Lawrence Saucer, who was a reporter, is still a reporter at the South Carolina Post and Courier. For me, that sets up either a yes or no question. I don't care whether people think he's a monster or not, but it can't be predicated upon misinformation. So a part of that stems from the country is literally obsessed with firsts, with fathers and mothers. Think about, even in my introduction, I do it because I was like, whether they like what I say or not, I'll get a hand clap on this one. I even heard a couple of people, yes, when they're like, she's one of 2 Black women to head up a medical humanities program in the country. One of 3 who will be an endowed professor in the history of medicine. People are like this, slow clap, because they like exceptionality, right? The thing is, Sims wasn't that exceptional. In fact, he was quite ordinary. And that's the thing that kind of pricks a hole in the balloon, right? I'm from South Carolina, and I remember giving this talk at the College of Charleston, where there is a James Marion Sims Society. And I just remember like this section of like very elderly white men who were like this. Like they were, and even without my glasses, I was like, they don't look pleased. But after the talk, they came up, well, there, lady, I was really quite surprised by some of the things that you presented, and you did a good job. I was like, well, thank you, sir, right? So even for them, in the kind of romanticized way they saw Sims, they weren't understanding the legacy, the landscape of antebellum slavery, right? And so for me, it was, how do I fill that hole, right, with information that's accurate? So I wanted to first start out with, how do I let people know this man wasn't that exceptional? Now, there were certain things he did that were pretty incredible for the time, but it really wasn't about the medical work, per se. It was about how he, in 21st century parlance, branded himself, and we'll talk about that a little later. But let me show you why he wasn't that exceptional in terms of how he treated enslaved women. So I've heard it all. He didn't use anesthesia on them, and he could have. Well, most of the folk in the antebellum era didn't use anesthesia during surgery. He believed Black women didn't experience pain. Guess what? almost every white physician didn't believe black people didn't experience pain because the science said black people didn't experience pain, right? He made those enslaved women work while they were his patients. And as a historian of slavery, I have to ask, what do you think enslaved folk did? It was an economic labor system. Guess what enslaved people did? They worked. Whether they were sick, whether they were healthy, old, young, disabled, they performed labor, right? So there are a couple of things where I'm like, but we can critique, even using the value system of the 19th century, right? And for me, that's where I like to say, let me point you in this direction, right? And it might be able to buttress or support some of the other critiques that are going on. So we'll first start this kind of intellectual journey by, a kind of chronological walk through time, especially with the history of science and medicine, starting with Georges Cuvier. He was French-born, probably the most preeminent natural historian, scientist of the day. And how does he enter into this conversation about medicine and science? It's the work he did, not on the living body of Sara Baartman, who I'll discuss in just a minute, but on her cadaver, on her dead body. And that actually has meaning because it helps us to now realize that African women have now entered into medical science and research, right? And the ways in which people want to teach their colleagues, their peers, their society, a nation about black bodies, about biological difference. And then there's Ephraim McDowell, American-born, who was known as the father of the ovariotomy. Essentially, he's the person who first successfully does the first abdominal incision and the patient lives, right? Removing a diseased ovary. Typically, they're ovarian tumors. John Peter Mattauer. Not many people have heard of these folk, right? All men who did the same kind of work or similar work before Sims. He was an early pioneer of the same condition, the surgical repair of vesicovaginal fistula. I'll talk to you later. I know some of you had food from the reception. I'll wait till you get your last bites and gulps before I describe it. But he was known as the father of American plastic surgery. And then Francois-Marie Provost, father of the cesarean section, right? Here is someone French-born like Cuvier who decides to move to France's most valuable, right, their richest colony, Haiti. And he performs experimental C-sections on Haitian slaves. Right? The women, by and large, die. So there was this thing called the Haitian Revolution. And a lot of French-born people weren't safe. And so he skedaddled to a former French colony called Louisiana. And right outside of Baton Rouge, Provost begins these experimental surgeries on black enslaved women in Louisiana, right? Doing the same kind of work. All of this happens before Sims begins his experimental research in the 1840s. And in fact, John Peter Mattauer writes an article about vesicovaginal fistula in the same medical journal that Sims publishes in almost a decade later. So he was privy to this information. And so what I share with the class today, and I'll share with you, when we exceptionalize individuals, we tend to forget about the institutional structures that were in place already, right? Sims didn't build the house, right? He may have added a wing to it. He might have tightened up a beam, but the house was already there, right? So the structure was already there. And that's what we have to remember, right? Because we can sometimes lose sight in focusing on one person. And so for me, it's like if we implicate him, then, right, we got to implicate them all, right? And because this was an institutional and structural issue. So let's first begin with Baartman, right? Most people have heard of her by the Dutch name, Sara Baartman, the anglicized one, Sara Baartman. We don't know her Khoi name, unfortunately. She was a woman born in South Africa. She was Khoi. And so oftentimes, people, even today, I hear it all the time, folk are not aware. They'll talk about, oh, I went to France, I went to Germany, I went to Cartagena, and then I went to Africa. And I was like, so where? It's a continent with lots of countries. right? So she was Khoi Khoi from South Africa, and she was at the Cape Coast. I'm sorry, the coast. And so she was enslaved around, and there's some discrepancy around her of her age, but about 17 to 20. So she was a young woman. She enters into our, kind of our history books when she sold from her owner to his brother and a British physician. Now, this is where I say, people like to throw the term revisionist historian like a pejorative. I'm like, you know what? If that's the worst I can be, I'll be it, because I need to revise inaccurate history, right? And the inaccurate history at first said, Sarti just went willingly with these two men, leaving South Africa, which is on the Indian Ocean, to go all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, to London, to seek fame and fortune, right? It didn't happen that way. She was sold from one slave owner to his brother and a physician who wanted to make money off of Baartman. And in fact, she was derisively called the Hottentot Venus. This was also something that wasn't new. If any of you have read, some of the slave narratives, in fact, the first one published in the English-speaking world, of Equiano, Olaudah Equiano, he talks about being called Gustavus Vasa. That's, in fact, in the title of his autobiography, right? Why was he named Gustavus Vasa, who was a Swedish king? Because his slave owner knew a slave couldn't ascend to royalty. Why was she called the Hottentot Venus? Hottentot was a derisive or pejorative name for South African blacks, right? And so, of course, a Hottentot woman, this black South African woman, could not be as beautiful as Venus, right? And so here she literally enters into popular culture with this name that she's given that doesn't represent who she is, that's really poking fun at her Africanity. And so she is made to dance and jump and do tricks, almost like she's a circus animal at Piccadilly Square. And why are people so fascinated with Sarti Baartman? Why is it that almost every illustration of Baartman in the late 18th century to the early 19th century depicts her in this way? Partially nude or flesh-colored clothing. Because literally, people are fascinated with the size of her buttocks. That's it. Now, I don't have to put my glasses on to see. I'm not the only black woman here. And I might gather it probably is a few of us who have large buttocks. It's not, there's nothing weird about that, right? She looked like any other Khoi Khoi woman. But there was this kind of fascination, attraction, repulsion to her anatomy, to her physique. And so you can literally see in this illustration, right, the different ways that you have a European society responding to her body, to her person, right? There's a person behind her almost reaching out to touch her buttocks. And then there's a woman bending to look at her knees, because there was also this belief that black people were more knock-kneed, right? There's someone trying to peer underneath the covering, right? What they call the Hottentot hood, because did she have an elongated labia? And then there's someone who is literally with a monocle, right? With the top hat all the way to my far left, literally tightening his gaze upon her body, right? And so there is a very particular way that people are now medicalizing blackness. There's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine, Rana Asali Hogarth, called Medicalizing Blackness. And she talks about the ways that black people's bodies are now seen as pathological. So she doesn't just have a large derriere. She has steatopygia, the enlargement of the buttocks. It literally is considered a medical condition, right? Something that is abnormal. Now, how she becomes a subject of science in medicine, after a few years in London, she sold again to a French animal trainer. And the animal trainer eventually sells her to the National Museum of France. And that's where Cuvier enters. She is kept in a menagerie. That's where you keep plants and animals. And Cuvier is fascinated with her body. He's trying to understand, right? Does she represent the missing link between humans and apes? right? Unless we think that this is something that is really abnormal. You know, I always go back to Thomas Jefferson's only publication, Notes on the State of Virginia, Query 14. Right? For people who study African-American history, I see a gentleman shaking his head. You know about that famous query, right? This is the one where he literally talks about the different complexions of the indigenous or the native people, white people who are the most beautiful and the smartest because you can see their emotions on their faces because of the rosiness of their cheeks. And then he literally says that black people who look like me, Jermaine can tell you, we're from the low country. We, you know, at home we say Geechee. Academic folks say Gullah Geechee. But we have dark skin and you know, round cheeks and full, you know, very West African features. And all of a sudden, he says, the people who look like me, right, it's because African women choose to mate with orangutans rather than their own men. That's and the thing is, Ibram Kendi has won almost every literary award you can think of. Historian writes about these racist ideas, like coming from some of the world's most renowned intellectuals. So this is not kind of the rantings of folk who we think are illiterate, right? These are the people who are literally creating science and ethnographies and these kinds of things. So Cuvier is really fascinated with her body. And so he's not able to examine her in the ways that he wants to until she dies. Remember, she leaves South Africa very young. She dies very young, at 25. And she dies with a host of sexually transmitted diseases. She had engaged in sex work. She became a heavy drinker. I mean, you can imagine the kind of life that this young girl had, isolated from her family, having to learn a different language and culture, all of these things. So when she dies, Cuvier dissects her body. He performs an autopsy, right? There is value in even the body of a cadaver. So he performs the autopsy. He removes her skeleton, puts it on display. He cuts out her brain, preserves it, puts it in a bell jar. Cuts out her genitalia, preserves it, puts it in a bell jar. And it is on display at the National Museum of Paris until 1974, until the brain and the genitalia are lost or either stolen. So speed up, in the 21st century, you have a South African government who is now calling for the return of Sara Baartman's remains so that she can be buried, right, according to the custom of the Khoi people. And this is the thing that, you know, always just, I was stupefied, and I talk a lot. I was really flummoxed. I had no words because the French government says, well, we don't know if you have the infrastructure to handle her remains. Number one, you all lost the woman's remains. They were on display and you lost them. I lived in South Africa for a few months. Trust me, the infrastructure is fine, right? And so finally her remains are sent back. She was buried properly. But this is how, right, you now start to have literally a school of writing and thoughts about Black women that stem from this moment, right? Now, if we go to this new country called the United States, right, we have Ephraim McDowell. Not many people have heard of him, right? Father of the ovariectomy. And what Ephraim McDowell does, he was born in Virginia to a really elite family. Father was a lawmaker, a jurist. His mother was very elite, white woman of the time, so she worked in the home. And Ephraim McDowell decides pretty early on he wants to become a medical doctor. You didn't have to go to medical school during this time. This is the late 18th century. So he and a close friend decide to apprentice for a local doctor. Now, I'm telling you this not as a bit of trivia, but because it's important to the context of what I'll describe a little later. The local doctor is also known as the town drunk, right? So they apprentice for this man, but they are frustrated because the doctor is the one literally practicing medicine, putting his hands on patients. Ephraim McDowell and the other apprentice cannot. And so they decide one night, after learning about the death of an enslaved man, that they would exhume the body and perform an autopsy. There was a word for it. It was called grave robbing, and that's what they did. Now, this is the thing. I grew up in a small town, So the thing I know that's true now, that was probably true then, there are no secrets in small towns, right? So here they are, they exhumed the grave. You don't just go and get a dead body out easily. You are making noise, you're bringing tools, shovels, all of those kinds of things. People are watching. So they perform the autopsy, they learn all of the things I guess they feel they need to learn. They put the body back in the ground, pat it over, and go on about their business. Well, people tell. The owner of that cadaver, right, it was still his property. He is incensed. Ephraim McDowell and his classmate say, oh, it was the doctor, because they figure he's the drunk. You know, of course they'll think it's him. But those folk in that little teeny town of Danville, Kentucky, say, we saw you. We saw you. And so how does Ephraim McDowell's parents respond to this controversy? They send him to Edinburgh, which is arguably the best medical school in the Western world. He completes his course of study, comes back to the United States, and his life literally changes. A woman, and she was a white woman, Mary Todd Crawford, comes to him in excruciating pain. Her stomach is bloated. It's really distended. She's a mother. She and her husband actually come. And she explains, I don't think it's a pregnancy. You know, so he asks her and her husband for permission to examine. Because this is also a time when men don't put their hands on women to examine them, right? So you have to ask permission of certain women. And so he surmises it could possibly be a tumor. So he says to her, you know, there's a possibility you might not live. I'm going to perform abdominal surgery to remove the tumor. Are you okay? She and the husband agree. Well, this is the thing. His reputation was already, you know, on shaky ground in Danville. The townspeople find out. They are livid. They call him a butcher. I mean, all kinds of things that they threaten violence. So he hatches a plan with Mrs. Todd Crawford and her husband and tells them to come to his home around 7 a.m. Christmas morning, 1809. He performs the surgery, removes a tumor that's almost 22 pounds. She was either in her late 30s, early 40s. The woman lives into her 70s. This was amazing. There had not been a written record of a successful abdominal-based surgery ever. And here it happened in this little teeny village of Danville, Kentucky, by this man no one knew. So what does Ephraim McDowell do? You would think he'd run, he'd write an article, he'd tell folk. He is inspired by the growing influence of science and medicine. So he starts to conduct experiments. And he gathers up a number of cases of women with ovarian tumors. But the thing is, all of them were black. About 4 or 5, one being a free woman of color, as they were called back then, the rest negresses who were slaves. And one of those women died. And he literally performs experimental surgeries on them over a number of years. Now, this is where I'm going to take a pause. A part of the critique has been, Sims has performed these surgeries for years. I was like, yes, because all of the other folk before him, when they do experimental surgeries, perform experimental surgeries for years, right? And if you are a slave-owning physician, like every last one of these people I'm mentioning, you have access to a really vulnerable population who can't tell you no. And in fact, you can get into a contractual agreement to lease slaves, right, to perform this kind of work. So Ephraim McDowell in Danville, Kentucky, that has a 4% black population during this time, finds these enslaved women with ovarian tumors, all but one live. In 1817, he finally publishes the article. And I just want to read. I'm not a real reader, but I always think this is important. He nearly waited nearly a decade before he published a groundbreaking article that described his successful procedure. It was called 3 Cases of Extirpation of Diseased Ovaria. It appeared in the Eclectic Repertory and Analytic Review. After the article's publication, McDowell's peers derided him. European doctors were the most vocal in their criticism of him because American medicine was still in its infancy and static or unchanging, and it had not produced any trailblazing doctors. One of the leading critics, British surgeon James Johnson, called McDowell, and I quote, a backwoods Kentuckian. Dr. Johnson also wrote, and I quote, "All of the women operated upon in Kentucky, except one, were negresses, and they will bear cutting with nearly, if not quite, as much impunity as dogs and rabbits." He finally stated that as doctors, and I quote, "Our wonder is lessened, since they understand Black women's propensity for pain, to handle pain was effortless," right? So let me provide context. These ideas had already been there. This is a British surgeon, right, commenting on McDowell's work. Okay, yeah, they lived. It was successful. But what do you think? You get women who produce, right, like rabbits, like dogs. Of course they can bear cutting. Childbirth is easy for them. They don't experience pain in the same ways. It's effortless, right? This was something that literally was already a part of the fabric of the Atlantic world when it came to understanding biology and Blackness, right? John Peter Mattauer, born in Virginia, like Ephraim McDowell, he goes to the University of Pennsylvania, at that time probably the country's leading medical school, and he comes back to Virginia, and he really isn't a gynecological surgeon, but he is confronted with the condition called vesicovaginal fistula with these enslaved women and also white women, and although it's not deadly, it is debilitating. So vesicovaginal fistula it was quite common during this time, especially for women who had a lot of children. And typically it happened with a protracted childbirth session that would last days, on average 2 to 3 days. And what happens is you're trying to expel the fetus, there is friction, right? Because you're trying to expel something from your body. And so in the upper vaginal wall, right, there's sloughing. So the sloughing creates a hole or fistula. The hole can range from microscopic to gaping. And then the vesicle or the bladder is revealed, right? So that creates incontinence. Now, if there's tearing, there's in the anus, right, or the anal area, there's incontinence there. So as you can imagine, right, you are ostracized. There's a lot of social ostracism. In today's language, we would say these women often suffered from depression. They had a stench, and so that was a part of the reason they were ostracized. But if you were enslaved, there was something else attached to that. Your value was lessened. Because this is where I like to now merge colonial history with 19th century history. And this is where the folk who are like really in this, but Sims, he took these women in and all of these men did this. I'm like, no. Let us be clear. In any European empire that created essentially a slave nation in the Americas, right, in the Caribbean and in the Americas, they literally changed the law around the status of children inheriting the condition of their fathers to slave children inheriting the condition of the mother. That didn't happen anywhere except in slave-holding America, North and South and in the Caribbean. Didn't matter if it was Dutch, British, right, French, Spanish. Didn't matter. So all of a sudden, you literally turn the whole notion, right, of a patrilineal heritage on its head, and you make it matrilineal. And they do that not because they're progressive. They do it because it doesn't matter who the father is. An enslaved woman can be impregnated by any man. A black man who's enslaved, a black man who's free, a native man, a white man. And that child, under that new law that takes place in the 1600s, inherits the condition of the mother. Why? Because enslaved women are literally their wombs, their healthy wombs, are what perpetuates slavery. And so after the ending of the slave trade in 1807, right, by 1808, all of a sudden you're hearing, especially in what becomes the United States, all you're hearing about is natural increase, natural increase, natural increase. So for me, this is the kind of uncomfortable position. When I talk about these men, they don't care about the experimental patients in some humane way. They are trying to repair these women's reproductive health and capabilities so that they can continue to be valuable negresses, so that slavery continues, right? Continues on, so that those owners accumulate wealth. That's how it works. It's an economic labor system. So John Peter Mattauer in the 1830s in Virginia performs experimental surgery on two women. One is enslaved, one is white. They both suffer from vesicovaginal fistula. They're both around the same age, young women, late teens, early 20s. And so after a while, Mattauer is able to repair the fistula, right, by silk sutures. So he essentially can stitch the hole together. He tries it on the enslaved woman, doesn't work. Tries it again and again and again, and 4 more times after that. He talks about 8 cycles of experimentation on this woman. And in his article that he publishes, for me as a historian, this was the moment where I was like, if this doesn't teach us anything about the distinctive differences in the ways Black women and white women were treated, I don't know what else will. He literally says in frustration, right, as he writes, the patient could have been cured in less matter of time had she stopped engaging in sexual intercourse. Sir, you're a Virginia slave owner. Your parents were Virginia slave owners. Your children are Virginia slave owners. You know good and well, no enslaved woman can say, no, not tonight, honey. They don't own their bodies, right? How in the world could she have stopped engaging in sexual intercourse? And so I am not saying that women were not oppressed during the antebellum era. Of course they were. But there is a distinct difference between someone who is free and a person who's unfree, who is owned. And so even in her healing, even in the experimental phase, she wasn't able to stop someone from having sexual intercourse with her over an 8-cycle period that lasted for years. All right? The person who everybody thinks this book is about, and I always tell them, I'm like, only one chapter is dedicated to the doctors. All the rest are about the women, right? But people like first, and they like fathers. And so James Marion Sims, South Carolina native, born in the upstate in Lancaster, and he becomes really well known because of the experimental work he did on vesicovaginal fistula. Just the same as John Peter Mattauer, but the way in which Sims really gains fame and a really kind of vaulted position in the field, he is a prolific medical writer. So he had already written many articles before he published on vesicovaginal fistula after the experiments. But also, Sims understood branding. Sims would literally pack the surgical room with onlookers, right? Sims was a man of the time in terms of being really consumed with, himself as a medical entrepreneur. And so he tended to name the equipment that he tried to perfect, in his words, after himself, right? And we'll see some examples of that. So if you think about a Zuckerberg or, for those people who Tyler Perry, Tyler Perry presents a Tyler Perry directed, that was James Marion Sims, right? Literally, right? Written, directed, produced, that was Sims. That's the thing that did make him exceptional. So Sims' life changes, not at first because of the enslaved women. Like Ephraim McDowell before him, a white woman comes in who had fallen from a horse. And this is what Sims writes in his memoir. Sometimes I go to medical schools, and when I tell this story, everybody laughs. I'm not a physician. I only write about dead physicians, so I don't know, right? But the medical practitioners tend to giggle at this. So he writes in his memoir that a Mrs. Merrill, a white woman, fell off her horse, and she was in excruciating pain because her uterus was retroversed, right? So it basically turned around. And she comes, she's begging him. He doesn't, as he says, I didn't do women's, I didn't fix women's ailments. She's begging him. He has pity on her. He asks, can I examine you? She says, yes. He opens up the vaginal cavity, and he remembered something from his medical school training that if you open up the vaginal cavity wide enough, the rush of air can be so strong that it will reverse the uterus right side up. That's what he wrote in his, I don't make this up. I don't make it up. I promise you. If you read the story of my life, that's how he writes it. He even talks about a little moment where, the air sounded like flatulence, and she was like, oh, I'm so embarrassed. And then they shared a giggle, and she got up off the table fine and got back on the horse and went home. I promise you, it's in his autobiography. So in the same hospital is Betsy. So we know the names of 3 of the enslaved women that Sims operated on, that he experimented on. Now, there were half a dozen, but we only know the names of 3, Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy. So one of those enslaved women was there because she was suffering from vesicovaginal fistula. And the reason why she was there is because Sims told her, I can't help you. There's no cure. So she lived in the really rural outpost of Mount Meigs, which is right outside of Montgomery, Alabama. And so he, just said, you can stay here tonight, but you got to go back to your plantation. But after Mrs. Merrill, he had he's literally a kind of aha moment. The light shone in his mind, and he thought, if I can actually peer into the vaginal cavity, perhaps I can see the fistula. And so he takes 2 pewter spoons, and he opens her up, and he writes, I had seen as no man had seen before. And he had once again, words from his autobiography. I promise I don't make this up. And so he saw as no man had seen before, as he says, right there at his nose, and he knew he could cure these women. So he, in his words, canvassed the county. He got about a half dozen cases that he leased from their owners, and they all came to Sims's practice. And as he says, I had a little hospital built for myself, right? So now this is not 1840s. Obviously, there were not photographs. This is a picture of the hospital in 1895. And so it was sold in the 1850s to one of his former surgical assistants, Nathan Bozeman. And essentially, when Sims says, I built this hospital for myself, I'm like, no. Here's my revising. So your slave labor force built the hospital for you, right? And it literally functions as the first hospital for women in the United States. But this is where things become a little fuzzy, because literally you have historical markers in New York that said the first hospital for women founded in the United States by Sims was in Manhattan. And I'm like, wait. His autobiography, named The Story of My Life, authored by Sims, talks about the little hospital I had built for myself for the treatment of women conditions. So guess what I do? Because I'm a revisionist historian. I'll take it. First page, first sentence of Medical Bondage says the first hospital in the United States for women was founded on the slave farm in Mount Meigs, Alabama, a little sleepy lumber town right outside of Montgomery. Because that's the truth. Because what that does is, right, the new narrative literally erases slavery from this. So all of a sudden, when people are like, wait a minute, slavery had something to do with it, they'll think you're making it up, right? So I'm simply using Sims's language and his words from the story of his life, right? So here's the picture, and literally you can barely see it because it's a grainy image. This is from 1895. There are 3 black people at this hospital for Negroes that was still being used to treat black patients. Towards my right, there's a woman kind of bent over on the porch, washing clothes by the bush here, like near the steps. Well, that's not a bush. Near looks like a water pump. There's a little black child, and then an older black man sitting on the porch. So for 5 years, Sims conducts experimental research. He is, literally research on these women's bodies. He is using silk sutures to try and, stitch the fistula or the holes together. That doesn't work. He is using lead sutures. That doesn't work. It really doesn't work, right? Then he says maybe silver sutures. And once he gets the silver sutures, according to Sims, that's what does it, right? And so, he waits for that first patient to see how she heals, and then he can heal the other half a dozen or so. In the interim of this 5-year experimental phase, he comes up with the Sims speculum. So if anybody has ever had a pap smear and there's that duckbill speculum, this is the prototype that Sims uses because it allows for greater observation or examination into the vaginal cavity, right? Sims, even for the lithotomy position, he calls it the Sims position. I promise you, I go to hospitals, school, I was just in Augusta last week at the School of Nursing, and they're like, you know, they still call the speculum by Sims's name. I see a couple of people shaking their heads, right? Now, if you want to talk about the exceptionality, that's what it was. He just knew how to brand himself, right? And I'm not diminishing the use of the silver sutures. I'm not diminishing that at all, right? But what I'm saying in terms of the essence, I messed that up, but that's okay. I can keep talking and bring it back. In terms of the essence of, Sims's legacy, it becomes really important to understand, right, what he was doing in terms of the work wasn't necessarily that new in terms of the ways in which, right, he's writing and thinking about Black women. Now, this is the other thing. So he doesn't use anesthesia. Sims didn't use anesthesia even when he moved to the hospital in New York at first in the 1850s. And let me explain why. Sims was very old school. Like Matower, he went up to Philadelphia, graduates from the Jefferson Medical College. And in that kind of old school way, what they called a conservative or traditional training program, how does one know that a patient can live through surgery? They scream, they move, they resist. And so very often when you look at when you read those old 19th century medical journal articles, the physician, the doctor will often say the surgery took 19 minutes and 40 seconds, or the surgery took 21 minutes. They pride themselves on speed and dexterity because if you put someone in what was called twilight sleep, the person could bleed out. There's no physical response to the procedure. And so literally they would have these patients who were conscious, being held down by the surgical assistants or nurses while, and this, black, white, didn't matter. They were being held down or restrained while the surgeries went on. The 1840s is also a period where anesthesia just wasn't used that often. Now, does that then mean Sims didn't believe the reigning, kind of scientific paradigms about Black people? Of course he did. Of course he did. Of course he believed they didn't have pain, right? Even in his autobiography, he's not like the Negroes. He was like the N-words, right? So this is not a man who was somehow absolved of racism because he was working to cure these women's bodies. He was working to cure the bodies of people owned by others so he could repair their property. And he was very clear on that. So now this is where, as a historian, you can also be a sleuth. Sims wrote in his autobiography that after about the 2.5-year, 3-year mark, he says the community, and by that he means the white community, withdrew support. And he claims it was because he kept failing at the surgeries, right? All of the surgical repairs just weren't working. And he had family members, he had members from the community. What are you doing? You're wasting money. There had been whispers that perhaps he had been using these women like guinea pigs and that he just needed to stop. He was being taken away from his family. And so I just thought, I don't know, it was just something for, kind of in my head, like something about this I need to investigate. But how do you investigate this when you're writing about a population? For me, it was about how to center the women. So this is really a history, not so much about the doctors, but the patients. So my questions were always based on what can I learn about enslaved women when they don't leave a written record, right? How do I find out? What are the sources that other historians are using to figure this thing out? So I literally just reassessed sources that had already been written. I looked at an 1850 census record. Every article and book I read about Sims talked about this 1850 census, but it was in the context of his wealth. Well, see, he really wasn't that wealthy because he owned or leased 17 slaves. So I said, okay, what I do know as a historian of the 19th century, the 1850 census was really important because it was the first one where you have a designation of mulatto on the national census. So I said, okay. Now I told you all, I already grew up in a small town in South Carolina. Jermaine can tell you, it's not too many, it wasn't too many light-skinned people in our town. And you know the ones who were kin to the, I'm not going to say the names of the elite white folk, because one of them is Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina. Quote me on that one, because it's true. So anyway, there were not many light-skinned people, and you could almost always trace the really light-skinned families in Williamsburg County to the white prominent families in Williamsburg County. And everybody knew, they just didn't say anything. So I'm in the National Archives looking at this, and I literally had a thought, maybe somebody's a mulatto, or a couple of people, I don't know. I go down, I see there are 17 slaves. They're all N for Negro, 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 M, Negro, 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 Negro. So wait, there are 16 Negroes, 1 mulatto. Okay, this is interesting. Who's the mulatto? It's a child. It's in fact, the youngest person on the slave farm. Is it a boy or a girl? It's a little girl. Where are the males, right? F, M, M, M. So only 5 males, all children. So I can at least make an educated guess, right? Because once again, I'm looking at a population that didn't leave records for me that was, that were written. So I can make an educated guess. The 5 males are the children of the enslaved women. There are about 2 or 3 little girls. Like I said, this mulatto girl is the youngest. The rest are women of childbearing age. There are about 2 who are a little older. And I suspect, once again, I don't know 100%. I suspect those other 2 women were probably there to assist. They might have already been owned by Sims. Now the real investigative work can begin. So I do the math. The little mulatto girl was born during the experimental trial. So now I have to question who really is the father of American gynecology. Is it Sims? Maybe for the work he did, but I don't know who the paternity is, right, for this little girl. And this brings in another question of biomedical ethics that go beyond the issue of anesthesia. Because for me as a historian, understanding the landscape of the antebellum era, that's not that uncommon for me to read. If you read medical journal articles, for the larger part of the 19th century, anesthesia really wasn't used on most people. Now, it's exacerbated, its non-use by racism and anti-Black racism for sure, but that was pretty common. I'm now thinking, how common is it for a child, a mulatto child, to be born during an experimental trial where you're trying to fix somebody's reproductive health? Wait a minute, your autobiography talked about the 2.5-year, 3-year mark where the community withdrew support. So now, I'm not a mathematician or a statistician, but I can do simple arithmetic. And this woman becomes pregnant around the time the community withdraws support. Even his 2 surgical assistants leave him. And that's why he had to train the enslaved patients that he was experimenting on as his surgical assistants and nurses. Like I said, I can't talk about the paternity because the reality of an enslaved woman's life is that her body could literally be abused, molested, raped by anybody, especially by those who owned her, right? Especially by those who were white in that society. And so that's the rub for me, right? Where I'm like, what in the world? How do people not pay attention to this? Oh, because they didn't center the patients, because the patients were Black women. And on top of that, because they were enslaved women. So people kept looking at the census for how rich Sims was, as opposed to actually looking at something that was glaring at them since 1850, right? So when people say, oh my God, you're so brilliant, I'll take it. But I promise you I didn't do anything new except just pivot my lens to look at Black women. Like that's literally all I did. And I came up with a different interpretation of the history by just pivoting the lens to actually look at the patients in this history of medicine. So once again, to show, right, the kind of ordinary stance of Sims as a medical writer, right? And even those involved in medical publication. Here you have, there were a number of articles that came out after Sims's 1852 article. So the experimentation ends in 1849. Sims suffers a bout of personal illness. 1852, he writes this article on vesicovaginal fistula. By 1853, he's in New York. By 1855, he founds the Women's Hospital of the state of New York. His life just descends, right? And then after his death, he's known as the father of American gynecology. So in many of these medical journals that are talking about Sims's surgeries, this is the image that you'll see. Now, this is a really interesting thing when you read it. Sims, just like every other doctor that I spoke about who was considered pioneering, is very clear in who their patients are. They will call them negresses, servants, slaves. They will sometimes list the name of the owners. The illustrations tell a different story. So literally, we're the slaves in this. And guess what people will often do? They'll believe the picture before they'll actually read the words. Like, I will literally have people in here, how you gonna protect Sims? I'm like, did you not hear what I said? Did you? You clearly didn't read my book, because Sims does not need me to defend him. But they'll like capture something and hold on to it. And so I'm like, so if people are doing that now, you know they did it then. This is literally the image that emerges. And all of a sudden, this looks like, really painless surgery. In fact, Sims is not the one guiding the surgery. The white nurse is. She's the one holding the medical instrument. Sims just simply has his hands at the edge of the buttocks with his hand placed, gently on the leg of the patient who is clothed, who has shoes on, unlike the enslaved women who were naked and on full display in front of an audience, because surgeries were rare, right? And so you invited elite folk, you invited the townsfolk, you invited friends and family to come observe. In fact, he got in trouble doing the same thing in the hospital in New York, and his board of directors fired him for doing that for the white folk. That was just Sims' practice, where he would just pack these spaces. So Sims does this, lest we think he's the only one. Another medical journal article. Nathan Bozeman, his former surgical assistant, writes about doing the same kind of surgical repair work, except this time he said his button suture was better than Sims's silver suture method. And so he talks about his slave, Matilda Stamper. And I was like, my goodness, Mount Meigs and Montgomery must have the whitest looking black folk in the world, because none of them are brown, not one. And I mean, my husband is a pretty white appearing black man, but I was like, how every black person in the 19th century looked like you and not me, right? There's literally an erasure of blackness around gynecology and gynecological repair, although the text is very clear that they're working on enslaved people. And so for me, right, the most important part is understanding, right, what kind of lies between fact and fiction, but also what are the implications and the legacies of a 19th century medical branch that was literally built on the broken wombs of enslaved women, right? And so we then start to understand that elite medical men, like all of the ones that I mentioned, literally meet the demands of clinical practice and those of clinical investigation in ways where they were confronted with the challenges of observing Black women's lives, most of whom were mothers, that existed somewhere between humanity and science. And I thank you for your time and your attention, your patience, and I welcome your questions and your comments. Thank you. Okay, anyway. Sure. We can.
The graduate students will.
Okay.
Answer. Okay. So
okay. Sure. So we have a quick Q&A. I know some people have to leave because of classes. Yep. Here's a mic. And if you could talk in the mic, because there are some people here with hearing impairment, so I always want to be conscious of that. Yes, I see a hand over on my left.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. And
You're
I have a
welcome.
question. I'm a OBGYN nurse practitioner, and I have seen and read a lot about the history of nursing. And your book was the first time that it helped to frame for me that the history of nursing that I was taught in school was very different from kind of elevating the history of these women who were probably the first professional nurses in our country. And I wonder your thoughts about nursing and kind of the erasure of nurses in that process too.
Thank you for that. It is interesting. I'm going to answer that by making it just a little academic, if you will indulge me. So you're right. These women were doing professional work. And it wasn't just Sims, right? I mean, you can read about other doctors who are also training enslaved women to do medical work. The interesting thing for me, where I then have to confront a kind of racial fiction, but also this racial cognitive dissonance that happens. These men will write the kind of prevailing racial ideologies or set of beliefs about Black people and women as if they're factual. But the very practice of what they're doing goes against it. So supposedly there's a biological distinctiveness between Black and white people, and yet they use Black people to cure white people. Racial fiction number one, right? Number two, Black women are, Black people in general, women are supposed to be a subset of men who are led by their uteri, right? Not their brains. They're not logical. Black people were literally the missing link between apes and humans. They lived in a state of arrested development, especially intellectually. And yet when the white community and those surgical assistants leave Sims, he doesn't turn to other white men or women. He teaches his enslaved women who serve as his nurses and his surgical assistants, and he teaches them the same thing he teaches those white men. Racial fiction number two. Right? And so, of course, for me, if we start to look at this as structural, and we start to look at the kind of institutional erasure of Black people, of poor people, of unfree people, then you're going to have, because I've heard nurses and doctors tell me the same thing. Oh my gosh, it was never taught. Slavery was never connected to this at all. And your book is the first one where I'm like, they're just like, oh my God, there's more than one example of this. And I was like, yeah, it goes back to the colonial period. Right? And so even when we think about the trade in body parts, where we move beyond just gynecology and we look at the ways that these fictions about Black people existed, but the practice was different. And I know it's going to seem like it's not connected, but I promise you it is. When we think about the stories that we learned about someone like George Washington, right? And George Washington couldn't tell a lie and had wooden teeth and all of that stuff that's basically fiction. But when you start to peel away the surface and you realize the set of dentures he had those were the teeth of enslaved people. Why were enslaved people's teeth healthier than the man who was a slave owner of hundreds of Black people? Because he had access to luxury items like sugar, rum, molasses. You literally read the books of slave owners who mete these out to enslaved people, maybe on a birthday, or typically during Christmas. And so here you have enslaved people with healthier teeth. And can you imagine a trade where you have to extract healthy teeth from men and women so George Washington has an outfit of teeth that looks good? That's how institutionally corrupt the medical system is, but people don't know it. So it isn't just nursing. It's having a whole gaping hole of knowledge about what slavery actually meant to the building up of medical history, medical professionalism, right, and research in this country. And so, my next book will be on medicine, slavery, and mental illness. Because I was like, I'll tackle them all. Right? Like, give me enough time and enough resources. I teach a lot at Queens College. I got 3 classes to teach. So I teach a lot in between these talks. But I'm like, give me enough time and enough resources. I'm going to start writing about the first hospitals created in this country that were lunatic asylums, right? And slavery had a lot to do with that too, right? So for me, I want to show the institutional and the structural underpinnings of slavery to medicine. So thank you. Yes, ma'am. Right here.
Do you have any records of what happened to the women
Oh.
that were operated on by Sims?
No, I don't. So there is a gentleman who, gosh, I cannot remember the man's last name. He's a former journalist. He is writing a book called Anarchist Quest. And he claims to have found Anarcha. I don't know. I mean, he's not a historian, so we look at records differently. I'll just say that. And so he claims to have found Anarcha. And he's writing this book that shows, that he says shows Sims had Anarcha, he brought Anarcha up to New York. And so as a historian, I was like, how could he do that if he returned her to her owner? I mean, I just have like historian questions, right? And I was like, and how do you know Anarcha wasn't a common name in certain parts? So I'm just like, dude, I don't know. I don't know, but he claims it. And I also will quote me on this because I'm going to bust it wide open because I think he wants to commodify the story. I said, why Anarcha? Why is her pain different than the other women? Well, she went through 30 surgeries. I said, the poor Irish immigrant woman, Mary Smith, who I write about, went through more for a year longer. I was like, so what is it? I personally think, because there have been a lot of books, poems written about Anarcha, I think she has an interesting name. And I'm like, Anarcha's pain, and it was painful, is no different than Betsy, Lucy, Nanny, Fanny, any of the enslaved women that I talk about, the little 8-year-old girl who's raped and died. I'm just kind of like, why are we exceptionalizing? I'm not saying she doesn't need to be honored, but you honor them all, right? And so that's my problem with the kind of exceptionalizing of certain people. The records are scanty. And so that really brings up the question of the archives. We are dependent literally on an archive where you're reading the writings of the people who owned and operated, experimented on these human beings. And so it's fragmentary. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. That was a really amazing talk. I was just wondering if you had access to records, like the lease records of the women who were leased to the doctors, and whether this is something that's a broader trend in the world of slavery that I had certainly never heard of. Mm-hmm. I mean, if slaves are leased for similar kinds of things in other domains, medical or otherwise.
Yeah, thank you for that. So his question is about the leasing of the lease records. So some, yes, not always. You will sometimes see newspaper ads. South Carolina's medical school was huge on putting ads out for slave owners to lease their slaves so that they could be fixed and returned. And this is the thing, sometimes, there are these kinds of hidden parts of slavery where I'm like, it was a business, right? Most people have heard of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. Harriet Tubman was first leased at 6 years old. Frederick Douglass is able to escape slavery because he was leased and was working on the wharf. Leasing was really common because most slave owners were not like a George Washington, my goodness, and Thomas Jefferson. So they were not huge plantation owners. They tended to be people who might own 2, 5 slaves, if the slave is aged, disabled. So you might want to lease somebody out or lease a number of slaves to do work. So it was really quite common. Typically, they were in the ledger books. Sometimes, if it was really contractual, there would be like judicial or court records as well.
But for non-labor purposes.
Oh, for non-labor. So this is the thing. All of it's labor if you're a slave. Even the surgeries. It's the use of your reproductive body, right? That's labor because these people are using it to gain something from you. Yeah. But I get what you're saying, the kind of medical as opposed to somebody digging a ditch. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on the gynecological disorders that were common among enslaved women. I was talking on Tuesday with my students about Fanny Kimball's diary, where she, as you know, interviews the enslaved women and they talk to her about their gynecological issues.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking in particular about these women who are working in rice fields and in swamps and the kinds of things that were plaguing them that they're alluding to, but they don't have the scientific language to talk about.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I remember you from, was it Oswald? Nice to see you again. So, yes, they suffer from vesicovaginal fistula. They suffered from sexually transmitted diseases. They suffered from prolapsed uteri, so your fallen womb. They suffered from burst bladders. They suffered from ruptured cervixes. They suffered from infection. They suffered from, the kind of, I talk about the medicalization of rape. That's one of the sections that I just didn't have enough resources to be able to give it the full attention that I needed to, because the records are, the archives is fragmentary. But the kinds of ways that, if one is raped, in the ways that you can enter or orifice, I'll say that, to be cautious of the children who are here. And what happens if someone is a child or they're a teenager and their bodies haven't developed? So all of those kinds of things that then take a rape patient, and I'm saying rape, even though we know it didn't exist legally for enslaved women. You have to then send a rape patient now to a physician, right, a doctor, to be fixed, and there's more intervention, often surgical, to repair those tears and ruptures and excoriated orifices. So those are also the ways that even with the sexual abuse of women, it enters into the medical records in really horrific ways. You read about the cancers, breast cancer, uterine troubles, as they were called, ovarian tumors. I mean, it ran the gamut. It ran the gamut. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. That was, I really appreciated the style of your delivery, the impassioned nature of what you were saying. It's a very important story with fantastic scholarship, and I think we had an insight into the process of your scholarship as well. And
Thank you.
So fantastic. My question really is about the professionalization of medics, and I teach a medical sociology class, for example, and there's quite a lot of abstract statistics about healthcare inequity and so on. One of the things that really obviously speaks to me is the way that it's kind of abstract. It comes off the textbook. It's read by the textbook. It's regurgitated and so on. So in terms of the teaching of pre-med students, for example, apart from reading your book, obviously, what is the place for teaching medical students this, for the pre-med track? It's fascinating to hear about the medical humanities or the health humanities, because we're trying to start something at Pitt in this exact kind of area. So I'm going to have to speak to you about that separately. But this kind of core knowledge, this kind of historical and anthropological knowledge is obviously extremely important. How do we teach this in the classroom when especially there's so many classes that have to be part of the curriculum and that type of thing? And then there's also the gen ed requirements and so on. How do you make these really, really important contextual information come to life for the students?
Thank you for that. So this is a question about the contemporary moment and how we can essentially translate this for pre-med students, even before they get to the medical schools. A part of it is to understand the history, right, and to be able to make that legible to a 21st century audience. So that doesn't mean that history is always neat. There are always ruptures, and it's not, it doesn't always follow a line, but there is something that is kind of permanent about anti-Black racism that has literally been here since the founding of this nation, essentially. And so when you have something like anti-Black racism that has permeated even allegedly value-neutral fields, what I tend to do is say, okay, let's think about the ways that doctors or medical institutions or researchers, scientists, talk about the high mortality rates and infant mortality rates. And up until just about a decade or so ago, it was always the fault of the patient. especially black people, poor people, they eat the wrong food. They're too big. They're fat. They don't exercise. They don't get prenatal treatment. And then I will open up medical journal articles and say, look at how slave-owning physicians talked about enslaved women and nurses. Almost identical. And now you have public health officials who are saying, wait a minute, this victim blaming, it wasn't called that then. Maybe we should look at the actual institution and some of the practitioners and the ways in which they're approaching these folks. Another way is to think about the kind of biomedical ethics around saying a population, i.e. black folk, are ignorant and superstitious, and they just don't like coming to the doctors. And they are their own worst enemies. They are the ones who create these really bad health outcomes. And I'm saying, if we're talking about Henrietta Lacks, we're talking about Tuskegee, we're talking about gynecology, we're talking about dentistry even, we're talking about anesthesiology, and we see the ways that black people have been treated by the government and medical professionals, why would they trust doctors? Like this, they're not just making it up. There's an actual history that's attached to that, right? And so once again, to understand these are not just kind of superstitious people afraid of the boogeyman, but that there's a longer lineage that undergirds those fears. And so for me, it's being able to use the past, because it's easy, to beat up on people who are dead. People don't feel that badly. You start to get into the politics of white guilt and shame and black rage when we start talking about the 21st century, which is part of the reason I chose the 19th century, right? so I'm like, they're dead. Don't blame me. This is what they wrote back then, right? And so, but that's real, right? And so when you start to show those kinds of things, the ideas about pain that still, permeate the ways that people are being taught, the kind of outdated pedagogical practices, but also knowledge content contained in textbooks in nursing. And when you start to see that, and I think show these students that it literally is mimicking something that people didn't necessarily think was broken. And then to also talk about the ways that insurance, the kind of, the insertion of insurance as an industry helps to buttress that as well, right? And the kind of race-based politics. I think when students start to have these kind of social science and humanities liberal arts courses, it creates people who have broader ideas about how to treat their patient populations. And it's not just about the practitioner's field of expertise, but they can understand, a more nuanced way to think about and treat their patients. Like if I say I'm in pain, it doesn't mean I'm on crack or I'm taking opiates. It just means I'm in pain, right? Those kinds of things. And even if I was taking crack, shoot, if I cut myself, I'm still in pain, right? I mean, it's not like the crack numbs the pain. I'm still in pain. Yeah, I'm just saying. All right, one more question. No, two more. And I got to get the elder here. But no, you go first, but you will be my last in the beautiful red sweater. All right.
There we go. Okay. Superb presentation. I'm an MD, and when you're talking, it just clicks on how this was never taught this way. You are focused on the procedures, on how it advanced, but the victims are never talked about. The procedures, there's not a human form behind it. It's just techniques and practices. Mm-hmm. So I applaud your work.
Thank you.
And when you said the erasure of Blackness, not just in patients, but also in physicians. So I worked in cardiology, and so there's a big disease called tetralogy of Fallot, and they give it to the surgeon that did it, but he didn't do it. It was the tending, but it was his assistant, which was a black person that actually mastered it, but he took the credit. So there's not just an erasure of the victim, but also of the physicians that have worked.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you know of any school that tends to focus the medical history the way, taking into consideration the race? Do you know of any, and if, do you think that this could happen in future medical schools where it is actually taught?
Mm-hmm. So I come from a PhD background, so I tend to know MD, PhD programs like Penn. They have an MD, PhD program where their doctors do that. Johns Hopkins is another. They are also fraught with their own challenges around their histories, obviously. Excuse me. I'm drawing a blank, but there are a number of medical schools now that are instituting medical humanities programs. The University of Nebraska, Omaha, their medical center. There is the Robert Wood Johnson School in New Jersey and Piscataway. So there are a few. The School of Nursing, their medical college in Augusta, Georgia. So basically the schools that invite me are the ones that are doing it. So I'm always preaching to the choir. And so I'm now thinking about, okay, how do I get to folk who don't think this is important? The gentleman back there was like, this is like the electives that people get. You all know the two physicians. These are electives that you get. This isn't like the core. And so I am working with a Black OBGYN, Karen Scott. She is working with Monica McLemore, who is a nursing professor, a huge reproductive justice activist. And then there are a core group of scholars and medical practitioners of all sorts. And my job in this whole enterprise is to essentially turn this into a language that's legible for any medical practitioner in the state of California. If you are enrolled in a medical school, in a doula program, in a midwifery program, this is the kind of information that you'll get before anything else. And so we're working on that. She now has, thankfully, a multi-million-dollar grant. And so I don't know how long it will take, but these are the kind of wonderful things that I'm able to now do, because I just thought, as a historian, who doesn't know this? And then they were like, doctors, nurses. And I was like, what? So, yeah. So I'm doing that to change curriculum. Yes. Thank you. And then this one last question. Thank you.
Thank you very much
You're
for
welcome.
a very engaging presentation. I have one, it's just a simple question. How do you, as a historian, account for oral history?
Come for what now?
Oral history.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, have you, or has anyone looked at people who've orally kind of reference to a surgery of an enslaved relative, or I know one time when I lived in Minnesota, I was speaking with an indigenous person, and she said, well, they never registered babies on the reservation for 6 weeks because they didn't expect them to live. So that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Do you have, I don't know if this is a question or not.
Yeah, no, it's so her question, thank you for that, was on oral history. So, because I'm doing such a long ago time, I have to use the oral histories that were collected typically during the WPA, from the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. So there are about a little bit over 3,000 oral history interviews. Not all of them deal with medicine, and particularly the women were pretty modest about sharing this, but there are some stories. The other thing that has been really helpful is me learning a lot about slavery in the Caribbean and in West Africa, and understanding where some of the kind of anti-Black racism came from in these colonial and 19th century writings. And so people meaning white doctors at the time, were really interested in this notion of Black people not experiencing pain. Why don't these Black women scream during childbirth? But in particular West African communities, I only mention it just a little in my book where I talk about Northern Nigeria and the idea of blood mothers and these kinds of things, and the kind of symbolic presence of blood. Some other scholars, like Sasha Turner is one who writes about childbirth and motherhood in Jamaica during the colonial through the 19th century, talks about the kinds of retentions that come from the West African nations that people are populating in the Caribbean, and the ideas around maturity. So when one undergoes, especially a first birth, you are supposed to be dignified in that process and not scream out, right? And so those kinds of things where sometimes for people like me who are US-based historians, I'm not looking at the other sources. I'm kind of looking in this country. And so for me, it's been really wonderful to now be able to hear what my colleagues who are doing Caribbean and West African history in particular are writing about the ways that these women are also approaching and thinking about childbirth. And that there might be a reason why some women didn't scream out because of the kind of cultural importance they placed on silence during that process. And it didn't have anything to do with pain, it just was cultural. Yeah. So those are some of the things that I've looked at. But thank you all for being patient. It is 6:14. Thank you so much.